If you're taking Anatomy and Physiology 2, you're reviewing the course, or you just want to learn how your body works, you are in the right place, because in this one-stop shop video, we're going to cover all the organ systems of Anatomy and Physiology 2 in a very simple case study. Eating snacks, watching a scary movie with your spouse. So let's get started. Hey everybody, Organized Biology here, where we make difficult biology concepts simple. Now a reminder, if you'd like these diagrams while you're following along with this video, please email Organized Biology and put in the subject line Anatomy 2, the number 2, right? So Anatomy, number 2, organizedbiology@gmail.com. So in order to start this class, I want you to know which organ systems we're going to cover. Now, in order to remember them, you need to remember cruel doctor. If you've ever had a cruel doctor in your life, this tells you all the organ systems of Anatomy and Physiology 2, which we'll go through. The cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, urinary, endocrine, lymphatic, digestive, and reproductive. Now, in this first section, we're going to talk about the digestive system, lymphatic system, and your blood. So let's first start with your blood, because that's all ANP2 is about, your blood. So what is it? Well, your blood is this river of life. It goes to every single one of your 30 trillion needy cells. And the goal of the blood is really to nourish these needy cells, as well as to take some metabolic wastes from them that they produce naturally. So remember, you have 30 trillion of these needy cells. And in order to stay alive, you need to continually provide them with a variety of different substances. Things like oxygen, things like glucose, things like other nutrients. I'm just going to list these out. Things that these cells need. So oxygen, nutrients like glucose, maybe some amino acids, so those base units of proteins, maybe some cholesterol, etc. Now, you naturally know where you get these things from, right? So like nutrients you get from your diet, right? Oxygen you need to get from the air through the respiratory system. But how do we get all these things to all those 30 trillion cells? The bloodstream, okay? So if we were to zoom in on the bloodstream, what we would see is a variety of different substances. First, we would see the cells, red cells all over the place. And these are naturally called red blood cells. I feel like sometimes anatomists are kind of lazy. So these are your red blood cells. I'm going to shorten them out if I can talk. These are also named erythrocytes because words matter, and erythro means red, and cyte always means cell. So anytime you see cyte, cell, erythro means red. Now the red blood cells we know are going to be carrying those oxygen molecules and delivering those oxygen molecules to the cells of your body. They can do that because they're made of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin likes to grab oxygen, then drop it. So we've got oxygen checked off the list, right? That's carried by our red blood cells. However, where do all these nutrients come from? Well, you know they're in your diet, you eat them, but in order to get them to the cells, you've got to get them in the bloodstream. But where are the nutrients in terms of the bloodstream? Well, they are found in the fluid-filled portion of the blood surrounding all of these cells, and that is called the plasma, okay? The plasma accounts for about 55% of your total blood volume. So, in other words, of the whole amount of blood you have, most of it, just over half of it, is called plasma. Now, plasma literally translates to fluid. So I want you to know that the plasma is about 92% water. Now, why water? Well, we know our bodies are made of mostly water, in the blood, in the cells, a lot of water everywhere. But we know that water likes to dissolve things really well. So inside of this water, about 2% dissolved in this plasma are going to be these nutrients, okay? So dissolved in the water, there will be all sorts of nutrients that we discussed earlier, like glucose, like amino acids, and cholesterol, right? Now, let me get this out of the way real quick. Nutrients that dissolve in the water well are things like sugars, like glucose, and amino acids. The problem is cholesterol is actually a fat. I want you to know that. Cholesterol is a fat. And other things are also fats in your bloodstream, like triglycerides. But what's interesting is fats do not dissolve well in fluid. So anytime you have a fat, let's just draw a fat like a big circle, a big orange circle. Anytime you have some sort of lipid or fat-like nutrient inside of your bloodstream, you actually have to have a coating around it called carrier proteins. That could be like albumin and globulin. So I'm just going to write like P all the way around these lipids. And we know that these carrier proteins are what we call hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means proteins dissolve well in fluid and they can kind of surround the lipid so they can carry it through the bloodstream. So imagine it like if this was the lipid, this little cap of the marker I'm going to pull off in a second, and my hands were like the carrier protein. And this air is the fluid of the blood. Well, the lipid can hop inside of the carrier protein and float around, and all in contact with the water is the protein. The lipid's kind of hiding inside of it. So that's actually how lipids are carried in the bloodstream. So I mentioned proteins carrying around the lipids naturally. So therefore, about 7 or so percent, maybe, actually my numbers are off, so I'm going to say about 6% will actually be different proteins. The two main proteins will be albumin, so albumin if I can spell, and globulin proteins, okay? Globulin, awesome. Both of these are considered carrier proteins. They can carry fat-based substances in the fluid of the plasma, things like steroid hormones, so fat hormones, cholesterol, other lipid nutrients. But interesting, we're going to see albumin come into play here in a second. All right, so this is the component of blood. So we got fluid, nutrients, proteins, and then we also have things like gases, so oxygen, some CO2. We also have some hormones inside. So less than 1%, I'm just going to jot down the rest of them, right? So less than 1% will be things like gases and things like regulatory substances like hormones. So regulatory substances like hormones. Awesome. And we're going to talk about hormones later on in the endocrine system. So as you can notice, there's a lot of different things in the bloodstream naturally because we need to deliver all these good stuff to the cells. Sometimes we need to tell them what to do with like the regulatory substances, and obviously we need to carry some things around well in the bloodstream with those carrier proteins. Now what I've drawn here is actually the level at which we have the blood feeding the cells. Okay, blood feeding the cells. So we're going to actually show how these things kind of interact and go in and out of the blood to feed the cells. So first off, this small blood vessel that's actually touching the cells of your body, these are called capillaries. I'm going to draw this as a capillary, and this is the smallest blood vessel, Okay, and all these nutrients in the blood need to get delivered to the cell so the cells can build proteins, make energy in the form of ATP, etc. So the way that happens is in the capillaries, there are tiny little breakages in the membranes and the simple squamous cells lining the capillaries, and these are called fenestra. So these are called fenestra, little windows. That's Greek for window, I believe. And so that is going to be an opening. That allows some of this plasma to leak out into this space with all of the nutrients, with some oxygen, with some cholesterol, etc. So all of this can leak out and then begin to feed the cells. So I want you to write just like the plasma can leak out. I always teach my students that this is similar to one of those sprinkler systems where it has the long tube and the holes poked on the top, so the fluid can flow out, right? So that way we can deliver nutrients to the cells. Now the problem is a lot of these nutrients, things like glucose, things like amino acids, require these cells of your body to have forms of transport proteins. So I'm just going to draw a couple boxes in the membrane of these cells, and I'm going to call these transport proteins, okay? These guys are going to help carry those hydrophilic substances. We're going to write hydrophilic, so water-liking substances, like those amino acids, like the glucose, etc., through them so that they can get into the cell. So what would that look like? That would look like glucose being this little hexagon right here, flowing through a specific transport protein called a GLUT1 or GLUT4 transporter, getting into the cell. Brilliant. Same thing with amino acids. Say we have an amino acid, we'll draw it in blue because it's kind of like a protein. Those amino acids would have to travel through amino acid transport proteins, get in the cell so the cell can then build those proteins inside of it. Is this making sense? Hopefully. If you have any questions so far, drop it in the comments below. And while you're at it, give this video a like if it's helped you so far. Now, what's interesting is with the lipid nutrients, as well as with the oxygen, so I'm going to draw the lipids here, And I'm also going to draw that oxygen here as well in red, if I can find it. There we go. And when these things are dropped off to the cell, it actually just flows naturally right past the membrane into the cell because these are hydrophobic things that can actually pass right through the lipid membrane. Okay, so remember, lipids and gases can diffuse across the membrane, whereas hydrophilic things like amino acids and glucose, other proteins, and ions also have to use those transport or carrier proteins, okay? So this is a pretty complex process, right? We've got to leak that stuff out, get it into the cell, flowing high to low concentration, giving all the nutrients to the cells. But what's interesting is we're actually leaking plasma, as I mentioned, out into this space, right? We've got the bloodstream, we've got the interstitial space, okay, the between space, and then we got the intracellular space. What's interesting is the plasma is leaking where? Well, I told you it is leaking into this interstitial space. And that could become a problem, right? Because if all of the fluid is now out of our blood into this interstitial space, that causes a condition called edema. We're going to talk about that later on. Edema is basically fluid accumulating in that interstitial space, in interstitial space. So when would this happen? This brings me to my first case study, okay? Remember, we're eating snacks while watching a scary movie. Well, these snacks are likely high in salt, right? We like to eat salty snacks like popcorn during movies. So what's interesting is when we eat a lot of salt, that is going to get absorbed into our bloodstream and we're going to have high salt. Okay, so I'm just going to write high salt in the bloodstream. Well, we know if we have high salt here, that's going to leak out into the interstitial space. Now, when we have a lot of salt, that increases something called our osmolarity. I'm going to write osmolarity. This is basically just the concentration of solutes or dissolved stuff in our blood. So normally, our blood is about, I'm going to write a homeostatic value here, so homeostasis. Normally, our osmolarity is 290 milliosmoles. That is homeostasis. So, to give you a reference point, pure water would be 0 milliosmoles, no solutes in it. But then ocean water would be about 1,000 milliosmoles because it's got a lot of dissolved stuff in it. Well, the bloodstream falls between that. But if you eat a lot of salt, we increase that osmolarity. So now let's say we've got an osmolarity of, we'll write 310. Okay, so we're at 310. Well, we know that fluid with 310 milliosmoles is going to leak out into the interstitial space. So now it's going to be 310 out here. Well, interestingly, I said homeostasis is 290, so your cells like to stay at 290 milliosmoles. So now we have a gradient, okay? So this is what's going to happen when we're eating a bunch of salty snacks. We're going to have fluid want to flow towards the high solute concentration. I'll say that again. Water or fluid likes to follow the solute. So in this case, would water want to go from the blood into the cells, or would the water want to go from the cells into the interstitial fluid in the blood? Remember, it wants to follow the solute. So in this case, we're going to have a lot of water. Okay, so I'm labeling this as water now. Water is going to want to leave the cell and get into this space. So water begins to accumulate into the interstitial space. What does that cause? It causes edema. And now it can also cause higher blood pressure because the water can eventually get into the blood again, fill up the blood, increase your blood volume, and cause high blood pressure. This is one of the reasons why eating a bunch of salty food can, number one, increase your blood pressure by increasing your blood volume and cause fluid accumulation in the space. That's one reason you may wake up after watching that movie in the morning and your fingers are swollen and they kind of hurt, right? That's because edema is happening due to that water pulling out of the cells into this interstitial space. Fascinating, right? So that is one reason edema can be caused. It can be caused by a variety of other things like heart failure. We won't talk about that in this video. Now, let's say that we're under normal homeostatic conditions though. So we're pre-eating our salty snacks. So we're going to say that the osmolarity is still at 290 in all these places. Great. There's going to be no net water movement in or out. It's going to stay kind of equilibrium on both sides. But what's interesting is we're still leaking out plasma, right? So the problem with that becomes if we have too much plasma here, we lose blood volume, do we not? Plasma's leaking out, we lose blood volume. So we need a way to draw some of that fluid back into the blood to reestablish our blood volume. I apologize, I'm having to erase a little bit here. You can erase with me if you can. But we will have in the bloodstream some proteins that I've mentioned already. These proteins are going to be those albumins. So I'm going to draw some big charged proteins. These are going to be albumins. Now these albumins create a pressure gradient called osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure means basically the pressure of water wanting to go into a space. So water, when it leaks out, I'm going to say 100% of that water leaks out, that water will then be attracted back, as I kind of drew here, towards those albumin proteins. And in fact, about 90% of the fluid immediately comes right back into the capillary, which is great because we're reestablishing our blood volume. But the other 10%, interestingly enough, is going to get sucked up into a separate vessel here that I'm going to draw like this. A separate vessel. And this vessel is going to interconnect with other vessels here. And this is the lymphatic capillary or the lymphatic vessel. So as that fluid leaks out into the plasma, some of it, about 10%, is going to leak into the lymphatic capillaries. And that is eventually going to go back into the subclavian vein and drop back into circulation. So the lymphatic system is basically a drainage system for some of that lost fluid in the interstitial space. And along the way, we'll notice that there will be different bulges in the lymphatic system that we will reach. And these are called lymph nodes. So I'm going to draw these, and these are called nodes or lymph nodes. And inside of those lymph nodes are another component, interestingly, of the blood that I did not mention. In the lymph nodes, we have a variety of white blood cell types. So I'm going to write a list of white blood cells, and we'll write it right here. And these are going to be leukocytes. Leukocytes translates to white cell, okay? Now I'm just going to briefly touch on them. Leukocytes, there are 5 different types. They will be in the bloodstream. They will be in the lymphatic system. The first one's going to be our neutrophils. Those are our general macrophages. They're going to eat bacteria and other pathogens, clean up debris throughout the body. We've got the lymphocytes. Those are going to be a part of our adaptive immune system. They like to live in the lymphatic system. They're going to begin making those antibodies, recognizing specific foreign invaders, fighting them off. Very important for adaptive immunity. The next one is going to be monocytes. Monocytes, very similar to neutrophils, slightly different germline. Then we've also got eosinophils that are going to be active during allergies and parasites. And then finally, basophils. Very uncommon white blood cell, but I always remember basophils burn, they create inflammation. So you may see some of these types of cells in the lymphatic system as well as in the bloodstream. And that's a lot of components. As you can see then in ANP2, we're really talking about how things get into and out of the blood, how they feed the cells. And now we're going to look at a more macro view, talking about eating that popcorn. How does that popcorn with all of its nutrients actually get into the bloodstream? So we're going to follow the alimentary canal, the tube of your gut, and see what's happening on different parts of it so you can understand the whole. Okay, so one quick thing I'm going to point out before we get into this is I want you to remember that out here is outside of your body, right? So anything you put into this tube of your gut that we call the alimentary canal, is going to be technically consistent with the outside world. So check this out. As we go out, the inner lining of this whole digestive tract, I want you to think of as still outside of your body, because eventually we're going to get to the anus, and that's going to obviously get out of the body. Now, the goal, however, of our digestive tract is not to keep things outside of our body, but we want to then get them inside of our body. And can you predict where inside of your body is? The bloodstream. So the goal is to get things from the outside environment and get them into our bloodstream. Very cool. So let's point out some structures as we eat our snacks. So we put our snacks into our mouth and we need to begin breaking them down, because we need to be able to absorb them across very microscopic, tiny little cells in order to get them into our bloodstream. So we need to take big chunks of food and break them down. That is obviously called digestion. We're taking big pieces of food and making it microscopic. So how do we do that? Well, we have two different types of digestion. We have things called mechanical digestion and then chemical or enzymatic digestion. So first, we cook our food, we break it apart, we maybe heat it up and that type of thing. We're doing different types of mechanical digestion. And then we're going to put it into our mouths, where we obviously have our teeth. We'll begin chewing up the food, and we'll also have these glands, either our parotid, submandibular, or sublingual salivary glands. So in your mouth are salivary glands, and these will contain different enzymes, okay, that we will put into our mouth. These are going to be enzymes. Whoops, there we go. And enzymes are going to act as little scissors, chopping apart different macromolecules, specifically lipids and carbohydrates in your mouth. Now from there, we will swallow it down our esophagus. And very importantly, in our esophagus, we have two sphincters, okay? Sphincters are basically circular valves on the top and the bottom of the esophagus. So we call them the upper esophageal sphincter and the lower esophageal sphincter, or otherwise known as the cardiac sphincter, because it's kind of located near the heart. So as we swallow, one will open up, peristalsis will push it down, and then the bottom one will open up as well. Now we're into, obviously, the stomach. Now in the stomach, we're going to continue breaking down the nutrients, specifically proteins. Inside the stomach, we have a lot of enzyme called pepsin, and we also have a lot of hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid helps unravel those proteins like long strings, and then the pepsin is an enzyme that's going to chop them up, begin digesting proteins. So now we've got all the carbs, lipids, proteins broken down by the stomach and the mouth, so that now we can absorb them across into the bloodstream, okay? So the stomach will begin churning mechanically and obviously chemical digestion with these different components. But in the stomach, there's not a whole lot that gets absorbed. We might have some water absorption. We might have a little bit of carbohydrate absorption like glucose and that type of thing. But we really don't absorb a whole lot through our stomach. Although alcohol you can. That's why you can feel the effects of alcohol pretty quickly as it gets in the bloodstream. So we will see some, like I said, components being absorbed into the bloodstream. Okay? So I'll write those down like water, alcohol, maybe some glucose. Okay? But the stomach is not the major part that we're going to absorb from. The major part is going to be this small intestine that we'll see here in a second. But first we have to pass through another sphincter. This sphincter right here is called the pyloric sphincter, because it's in the pyloric region of the stomach, the end part of the stomach. Then we get into this section of the small intestine called the duodenum. Okay, very short, about 25 centimeters long, and this is called the mixing center, okay? So although we've broken a bunch of stuff down, we still need to break things down further. So we will have the components from the liver, things like bile that will help us digest and emulsify fats. And we'll also have different pancreatic digestive enzymes coming, obviously, from the pancreas, passing through the pancreatic duct. So again, this is the pancreas here, putting those digestive enzymes in. So as you can see, there's a lot of different components coming into the duodenum, the food, and then all these different digestive enzymes and bile, okay? Now, as it goes through the duodenum, we're eventually going to get to two other structures inside the small intestine. This first one after the duodenum is called the jejunum, okay? And then we're going to finally get to the ileum, okay? Ileum. Notice the ileum is spelled with an E, not an I. That's your hip, interestingly enough. Now, at this point, we've got several feet of jejunum and ileum. It's about, I believe, about 12 to 15 feet worth of your intestines are just this small intestine. This is the maximum site of absorption, okay? So if you get that question on a test, where are most of the nutrients absorbed in the digestive tract? Small intestine. Now, if we were to zoom in on the lining of the jejunum and ileum in the bloodstream, we would see something like this, very simply put. We would see, if I have the bloodstream on the bottom, here's your blood, Okay, it would actually be slightly deoxygenated, it'd be dropping off oxygen, so it might be a little more purple than blue than red. But then we'll have those intestinal cells, okay? So here are the intestinal cells, and they're going to be looking like this, okay? Just like that, a little more columnar. And the food and the nutrients will be traveling through on the top, kind of through this little tube here. It's all right, nutrients here. They are now in their base unit, very tiny. Now these nutrients want to get from here outside of the body to the blood inside the body, right? So we see in the intestinal cells, we have these small projections of the cell membrane to increase the surface area for absorption so that so many nutrients can get absorbed all the time constantly. These little projections, if I can talk, are called microvilli or tiny fingers, okay? So that allows for maximum absorption through a variety of different proteins, and then we're going to absorb them into the bloodstream. Now, I want to note here that the two things, or the two major macromolecules we'll absorb here, are proteins, the amino acids, as well as carbohydrates. Interestingly enough, I have to go over here to talk about how we absorb fats. So we'll draw fats as orange, and you see that there's a lymphatic vessel here, right? This is called a lacteal. It's a specialized lymphatic vessel that is made to absorb fats. So any sort of fats or lipids that you are going to ingest, they have to get processed out by some of the intestinal cells, and they will make their way into these lacteals. And they will follow the lymphatic system all the way back, same exact way, through some mesentery lymph nodes, and then the thoracic duct, back to the subclavian vein, and get introduced into circulation. Now you should be saying, Mr. J, I thought this was fluid though, just like it was the plasma, right? The lymph is really plasma. So therefore, don't the fats have to have a coating of protein to carry them around? You are exactly right. These lipids are called, a fancy name called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons. These are basically fats on the inside. They will have some phospholipids on the outside that are a little more hydrophilic, okay, kind of holding on to them. And we will also have some of those proteins like, I forget what it's called. I think it's apolipoprotein B or something like that. ApoB is the short. And you'll have those proteins on the outside basically coating those fats so they can be carried very carefully through the lymphatic system, okay? So those are how the major macromolecules are absorbed. We'll also be absorbing things like salt and water and other minerals, vitamins, those types of things throughout the small intestine. Now, as we get to the end of the small intestine, we've basically absorbed most of the snacks that we've been eating with our spouse. It'll finally get to a section called the large intestine after passing through what's called the cecal sphincter. Okay, so the last sphincter here until we get to the anus. Now, we're going to enter the cecum where we have our handy-dandy appendix. It's going to be a little haven for bacteria. It gets inflamed easily and it could cause appendicitis. We don't like that. But as we get into this large intestine here, we've got three main parts. We've got the ascending, so up, transverse across, descending down, and then actually sigmoid is the fourth one here, the S-shaped. And these are all a part of, again, their colon, or you can also call it the large intestine, same exact thing, okay? At this point, we're actually going to be absorbing some vitamin B12. We're going to be absorbing some minerals, some salts, and the remaining water that we need to absorb, okay? So all of those things, again, will be coming into the bloodstream absorbing. Now, as you notice, I drew the bloodstream throughout this process in a specific way, right? I drew it kind of going this way, going back this way, and you notice that all roads from the bloodstream of the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine lead to the liver, right? This bloodstream right here that I've drawn, okay, of all of these different sections, and they would actually converge on each other, so it would really look more like this, okay? This is called the hepatic portal system. Hepatic portal system, literally translating to the liver portal system. We're basically transporting all the blood that we've just and all the nutrients we just absorbed, and we're throwing it into the liver. Why? Why is that the case? Well, most of my students usually say because the liver can kind of filter out the bad stuff. And that's true. The liver has a bunch of enzymes that can detoxify perhaps any sort of poison that you may have eaten or drank, like alcohol. Alcohol is a poison. So alcohol dehydrogenase in the liver will chop up the alcohol, prevent too much of it from getting in your bloodstream and becoming toxic to you, right? So that's one reason, but it's also because the liver can decide whether to store or release those nutrients into the blood. It's basically deciding, hey, do we have enough glucose right now? If we do, let's just store some. If we don't have enough, let's throw it into the bloodstream. So it's kind of picking and choosing what goes into the blood and then what stays stored in the liver, okay? Very fascinating. So that's what's happening as you're just eating snacks, digesting all this stuff, absorbing all this stuff, going to the liver, storing it, releasing it, detoxifying it, what have you. What's interesting is we need to be able to tell different cells when to absorb things and when to begin churning and that type of stuff. So we need the help of the endocrine system, which we'll talk about next, as well as the urinary system, respiratory system, and cardiovascular system, all working together to keep our body in homeostasis as we're bringing things in and out of the body. Okay, so now we're going to talk about you getting scared during the scary movie, and you also have salty blood. So we're going to hopefully prepare yourself to fight off whatever's scaring you from the movie and fix your salty blood. Now, you may have noticed I changed shirts. If you would like any merchandise, you can go ahead and check out the shop below, buy some shirts, buy some bags, all of that to represent organized biology. So let's get started first with what's happening inside of your brain, specifically in your pituitary gland, when we have both salty blood and we are going to be scared. So we're going to talk about those hormones that are coming into play here, but I'm also going to talk about all the hormones so you can get a big overview of ANP2. So we're zooming in to the pituitary gland. It's also called the master regulator of homeostasis, and we're zooming into it right here. Now, the first thing you need to know is this man is facing that way. So this is going to be the anterior side here, and this is going to be the posterior or back side this direction. So we separate out the pituitary gland in front, anterior, and posterior sections. Now, above the pituitary gland, I mentioned it's in the brain. So this region of the brain that has these neurons here is going to be the hypothalamus. You can remember that the hypothalamus deals with that H word, homeostasis. So all in all, we've got this big endocrine, well, it's actually tiny, but it's a very important endocrine gland here connected to the hypothalamus, also dealing with homeostasis. So what's happening here? Well, these neurons that we're talking about always secrete neurotransmitters. You learned that in ANP1. But in this case, the neurotransmitters aren't actually going to be neurotransmitters, they're going to be hormones. So let's start first in the posterior pituitary. We see this neuron in the hypothalamus sending its axon all the way down directly into the posterior pituitary's bloodstream. Now, when this neuron will get stimulated, it will release those chemical messengers, and these are going to be the hormones, okay? Now, hormones, simply put, are chemical messengers that travel in the blood, therefore they go everywhere, and they're going to act on cells to change their function. Okay, so we're going to have some hormones maybe look like that, and maybe we'll have some hormones that look like this, okay? Now, how did they get released? Once again, it's by these neurons in the posterior side of the pituitary directly into the bloodstream. That's how the posterior pituitary releases its hormones. However, on the anterior side, the neurons will actually release hormones into the bloodstream first, and these guys are going to be called releasing hormones. Now, if you want details on the specific types of releasing hormones, you can check out my endocrine video, but we're just going to classify them as releasing hormones. Why? Because these guys are going to travel down in the little portal bloodstream of the anterior pituitary gland and bind to actual anterior pituitary cuboidal cells. So they're little cube-shaped cells. And these releasing hormones will bind to these anterior pituitary cells, and then, and only then, will the anterior pituitary then release their own hormones. So maybe we'll make it like a red square here. So as soon as they get that signal from the releasing hormone, these cells will release their hormones into the bloodstream, and only then. Okay? So those are two different mechanisms of the pituitary gland. Now, on the posterior side, there are two different hormones that will be secreted, okay? So on the posterior side, again, I'm gonna write posterior pituitary. we are going to release two different hormones. And we remember this by the acronym point of view, POV, posterior pituitary oxytocin vasopressin. So I'm going to write that here, POV, oxytocin, and vasopressin. Now, another name for vasopressin is ADH. And I'm actually going to show vasopressin as a blue triangle in this diagram. Now, what do these two guys do? Well, oxytocin is released during childbirth, interestingly enough. It'll be released, it'll go to the uterus, tell the uterus to contract, thus stretching the cervix, trying to push that baby out. The stretching further makes a positive feedback loop. Oxytocin is released, uterine continues to contract. So that's the importance of oxytocin in childbirth. And it's also going to eject milk during lactation. So whenever you're feeding a baby, it's also going to allow that milk to get out of the mammary glands. It's also slightly released during orgasms, during sex, as well as just during any sort of bonding time. It's considered the bonding hormone, okay? Now, vasopressin, ADH, this is when we're going to help. So the function of vasopressin is going to act on the kidneys, okay, specifically the distal convoluted tubule, we'll get to in a second, to reabsorb more water. So I'm going to write that all out. Now, why am I doing that? Why am I writing it all out? Because remember, what was a problem? Our blood was salty, right? Our blood osmolarity, we had mentioned, went to, say, 310 milliosmoles when it should have been 290. So the best way we can fix that is bringing in more water, diluting out our blood so that we can then get it back to 290. So how does that happen? Well, let's actually check it out. So vasopressin is released, ADH, another name for it, right, is released when our blood osmolarity is too high. That will travel in the bloodstream, go everywhere. We'll see the heart's pumping the blood everywhere, including the renal artery. So this artery right here is the renal artery, standing for kidney artery. Anytime you see renal or ren, that stands for kidney. And it's going to get into the kidney. Now, as we look at the kidney, the goal of the kidney is to disperse that blood throughout itself, reabsorb, so bring back into the blood the good stuff, and get rid of the bad stuff and the excess stuff as urine. So we see here, if we zoom in on one of the cortical nephrons, so the cortical functional units of the kidney, we see again the blood getting into this little section. This little section of blood vessels that will get filtered is called the glomerulus. Okay, so glomerulus basically means ball of yarn. It's a ball of yarn looking like capillaries of the bloodstream. And some of the components of the plasma are going to leak into this tubule. So everything in black is going to be the tubule of the nephron. Tubule of the nephron. All right, so just get your bearings here, right? We got some plasma components filtering into the tubule. Now, if those components in here were to stay in the tubule the whole time, all the way through, we are going to exit that out as urine. So remember, if it stays in the tubule, it's out as urine because technically this is outside of your body now. It's going out of your body. But again, the goal isn't to just excrete out everything, it's to actually reabsorb things. So the cells lining the whole tubule will be able to toss different components like water back into the bloodstream, different things like salts and other beneficial solutes. Okay, that's how it works. So we can either, again, keep it in the tubule, pee it out, or we can reabsorb it back into the bloodstream because of these capillaries that are surrounding the tubule. Very interesting. Now, there's a lot more to do with that, so let me give you one more homeostatic value, which is your GFR, your glomerular, if I said that right, glomerular filtration rate. That is the rate at which we are filtering fluid into this, again, this tubule of the nephron through the glomerulus. And we need that to be somewhere around 100 to 120 milliliters every minute. That is a homeostatic variable, okay? We need to have that there because it means we're filtering out the bad stuff at the right rate. Now, just note that we're coming back to ADH, right? We're going to tell the kidneys to reabsorb more water. How does that work when we're eating a bunch of salty popcorn? Well, ADH will begin to go through the bloodstream, right, and act on these distal convoluted tubule cells. Okay, so you see how ADH came through the bloodstream and binding to these little receptors. What that will tell these distal convoluted cells, so again, let me label this as the DCT, distal convoluted tubule, contrasted with the PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. These cells will then be told, hey, rather than peeing out all of this water here, so I'm going to say this is water, we're actually going to say, hey, we need to make some more channels so that the water can pass into the bloodstream. So we're making these channels, they're called aquaporin proteins, so that we can reabsorb more water back into the bloodstream. So that's how a hormone works in general. It travels through the blood, acts on a receptor, tells the cells to change their function so that we can maintain some sort of homeostatic value. In this case, it's water and solute amount, because if we're reabsorbing water back into the bloodstream, what will happen to this milliosmolarity number? Well, we add water and we are going to decrease the solute concentration back down to 290, which is our homeostatic variable, right? Fantastic, okay? So that's how hormones work. Again, act on a receptor, change cell function to maintain homeostasis. So that is ADH and oxytocin in the posterior pituitary gland, and that's generally how the kidneys work as well. So we're just gonna table that. Now, let's say, for example, the glomerular filtration rate, I can't say that right, filtration rate drops. Let's say that is going to drop to, say, 80 milliliters every minute. Okay, well that means we are now off of homeostasis. In that case, now our filtration rate decreases. We're not filtering out the toxins we need to, and that could build up some bad stuff in our blood. So what the kidneys will begin doing is these juxtaglomerular cells around this area are going to produce a hormone called renin. Renin is going to eventually trigger something called the RAS system, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, to eventually increase blood pressure. That will help us. If we increase the pressure of the blood towards the tubule of the kidney, we're going to increase that filtration rate back. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more about the RAS system and the details of it, I do have a video on that as well. Okay, so let's continue on. So renin, again, was in a way a type of hormone to trigger all these things to raise blood pressure. Let's come back to the anterior pituitary gland. Now, I mentioned the releasing hormones to trigger these guys to release them, but what hormones are there in the anterior pituitary gland? Several different types. I'm going to give you a brief overview and also talk about one that will be released when you're stressed from the scary movie. So let's check them out. So I remember the anterior pituitary hormones by the mnemonic "Tag My Pretty Girlfriend," because I remember I didn't tag my pretty girlfriend in a Instagram post at one point, and she got very hormonal on me. That's a joke, but remember, tag my pretty girlfriend. Tag my pretty girlfriend. Okay? This is going to be the hormones, again, released by the anterior pituitary cells. So these are all those red squares that I was talking about. And there's many different types, and a corresponding releasing hormone will trigger any one of those. So the first one is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That hormone will be released, talk to the thyroid gland, then the thyroid gland will then release T3 and T4, very key metabolic hormones, to keep your metabolic rate up. The second one will be ACTH. That's the one that's actually going to be released during a scary movie. It stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. What does that mean? Well, adreno stands for the adrenal glands, which is right here. These are the adrenal glands that are the kidney hats. They sit on top of the kidneys. And we see cortico. Cortico always refers to the cortex of the structure we're talking about. So in this case, adrenocortico, the cortex of the adrenal glands, and then tropic hormone. Anytime you hear the word tropic, it means it's a hormone that's going to tell another cell to release its hormone. As an example, all of these releasing hormones are tropic hormones because they're triggering these cells to release their hormones. So in other words, ACTH, I'm going to draw this a little bit. ACTH, if we drew this, say, as a black circle, will travel down to the adrenal cortex, bind to the adrenal cortex receptors, and that will tell the adrenal cortex to release something called cortisol. Cortisol, you've probably heard of as the, in a way, stress hormone. It is released during times of dramatic stress, like when you're watching a scary movie. So cortisol travels through the bloodstream, basically amplifies your fight or flight response, and so therefore we are getting, in a way, stressed, although that's not comprehensive what it does, okay? So that's just one example of what's happening when you are watching a scary movie. Now there's other important hormones released by the anterior pituitary. The G is going to be called growth hormone. Growth hormone likes to act on bones and muscles, triggering them to develop bigger and stronger as you get older, and also to heal you throughout the night. The fourth one is melanocyte stimulating hormone. This one actually has been found to not really have a physiological function, but they thought it stimulated melanocytes to make melanin, so most teachers will just table that and not worry about it. Prolactin is a hormone that will be released during lactation, right? So after you give birth to a child, if you're a female, you'll produce prolactin. It'll go to the mammary glands, tell them to start producing milk. Now the last one are going to be a classification called gonadotropins. Gonadotropins, there are two types of these. There's LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Both of these will travel to the gonads. So I'm just going to draw an arrow to the gonads, whether it's the testes for males or ovaries for females, and it will trigger sex hormone release. Okay? Now, sex hormone release, those hormones could be things like testosterone, especially if you're a male. It can also be estrogen if you're female, and progesterone if you're a female. Okay? So these are all different types of sex hormones that are triggered, again, by the gonadotropins. Okay? Brilliant. So we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. So that is all of the different hormones of the pituitary gland, and that's just scratching the surface. Let me give you an example that doesn't actually include these. If you get stressed, what begins to happen to your heart rate? Well, it begins to beat faster, right? So your heart starts to beat faster because you're perceiving some sort of dangerous stimulus. Why is that happening? Well, let's see. We know that you have a division of your nervous system that I'm going to draw down here called the sympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system we learned about in the A&P1 review video, and it stimulates your body towards fight or flight. There are neurons that will branch off your sympathetic divisions and come and communicate specifically with the middle part of the adrenal medulla. So this is the adrenal, if you want to label it, the adrenal medulla, the middle part of the adrenal glands. When sympathetic neurons get stimulated, they talk to the medulla, and the medulla begins producing a very important fight or flight hormone called epinephrine and norepinephrine. We're just going to stick with epinephrine. We're going to draw it as an orange triangle. Okay? Now, epinephrine does a variety of things. It dilates your pupils so you can see better. It increases your blood pressure by vasoconstricting arteries. Does a variety of things, but especially it will come in and talk to the heart tissue. One particular part that we'll talk to, I'm realizing I should have drawn this as a square, so fix that. That's my bad. One particular part it will bind to is actually the SA node of the heart. When it binds to the SA node, we know the SA node is the pacemaker of the heart. So I want you to write that, pacemaker. It is the one that's going to tell basically when the heart muscle should contract. So if we were to follow how the heart beats, is we've got the SA node will fire first. So I'm going to write SA node fires first. You see that number 1 here. When it fires, it'll fire and communicate with the atria. Those will be the top parts of the heart, the atrial muscle cells. So I'm going to write SA node, and then it's going to go to the atrial muscles. That's when the top part of the heart contracts, okay? So that's the first part of the heartbeat. Immediately after, the SA node's signal action potential will travel down to number 2. This is the AV node, otherwise known as the atrioventricular node, because it's found between the atria and the ventricles of the heart, which we'll get to in a second. Once that fires, it's going to travel down what we call the bundle of His. Bundle of His. So it's nervous tissue branching down into this little bundle here, and then they branch off, number 4, into 2 separate bundle branches. Bundle branches, because they're branching off. And finally, we're entering into the ventricles here on this side, and it's going to be via the Purkinje fibers, these last sections. So the Purkinje fibers will then trigger action potentials in the ventricles, so the ventricles contract. So I'm going to jot that down here. So ventricle muscle, or ventricular muscle, will then contract. So you see how the heart beats. It is going to be atria first, boom, ventricles immediately after. Atria ventricle, atria ventricle, atria ventricle. And that is kind of how we hear those 2 sounds of the heartbeat, because the valves will be closing. So that's the 2 sections of the heart beating. And again, that will be sped up whenever we have epinephrine binding to those SA node cells, speeding up how often we send those action potentials, thus speeding up the heart rate. Now, we need to review, obviously, how the heart beats. What's going on in the heart? Well, we know the heart is divided into 2 sections. This is as if you are looking at the heart, so be very careful with this. If you're looking at a person's heart from the front, this side would actually be their right side, and this side would be their left side. So I'm going to label that. This side would be their right side, and then this side would be their left side. All right? Now we are going to actually follow what's happening in the heart so we can understand where the blood's flowing and why it's flowing that way. But the reason we're dividing it into 2 sections is, one, you can see in blue, is going to deal with deoxygenated or low oxygen blood, and one side is going to deal with high oxygen blood, okay? Red, oxygenated. Cool. So let's start first with the deoxygenated blood in number 1. In number 1, this is the chamber of the top right side of the heart, and this is naturally called the right atrium. The right atrium literally translates to the right chamber, okay, on the top. Now, I always remember the atrium are on the top, and they look like the letter A, okay? So very easy to remember. From there, the right atrium will push some blood through it, and you see there's a little valve right here that can open and shut, open and shut. This valve in between the atrium and the ventricle is going to be called multiple things. One, it could be called the tricuspid valve. It could also be called the right AV valve, right atrial ventricular valve. And the goal of all of these valves that we will see is to prevent the backflow of blood. We want blood to flow in a one-way direction throughout the cardiovascular system. So we pump the blood through that tricuspid valve. Now we get to the right ventricle, right ventricle. And what's nice about the ventricles is they are on the bottom and they look like the letter V, right? So right ventricle. From there, the blood will get shot upward to the moon through another set of valves. This valve right here is going to be called the pulmonary semilunar valve. It's sometimes just called the pulmonary valve as well. Now, you notice I said we're shooting it up towards the moon, right? That's where I get that lunar. It looks kind of like a half moon. Semilunar, that's how the valve looks. So we're pumping it through the pulmonary semilunar. Well, what is pulmonary? Well, that means lungs. So that blood is going to travel towards, eventually, the lungs as we see, right? So we call this, number 3, this vessel that we're pumping it through, the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery. Arteries, A, always carry blood away from the heart. So we see we're getting the blood away from the heart, pulmonary, towards the lungs, artery, away from the heart. Very cool. So as you can see, deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs. At the lungs, I hope you know this at this point, we are going to exchange gases, right? So in the lungs, I'm going to erase this 4, we will have a high amount of oxygen and a relatively low amount of CO2 in the air. Well, at this point in the blood, we have a relatively high amount of CO2, and we have a relatively low amount of oxygen in the blood. So therefore, it's just a concentration gradient, y'all. The high oxygen wants to flow from lungs into bloodstream, and the high CO2 wants to flow from bloodstream into lungs and out as you breathe out. It's just a concentration gradient, high to low. So that's what's going to happen at what's called the alveoli of the lungs, the little gas sacs of the lungs. We're exchanging all that stuff. So now, think about it. We just gained oxygen into the blood. We lost CO2. So now we're going to turn it pretty oxygenated, which we'll see in a second. So let me jot down lungs for number 4. And now we're bringing the blood back towards the heart from the lungs, and it is very oxygenated. We call this then the pulmonary, coming from the lungs, vein, because veins vacuum blood back towards the heart. Remember that. Once we're back, now we're going to go to the left side of the heart. This is going to be the left atrium of the heart, left chamber again. We're pumping it through another valve here. This valve has 3 names. One is the mitral valve. It's the most common. The other one is going to be that left AV valve. And then the last one, it could be called the bicuspid valve. The most common name we use is the mitral valve, okay? So it pumps through that valve. We get to number 7. This is going to be the left ventricle, as you can guess. And then we're shooting it up towards the moon once again. So we've got another semilunar valve in this vessel, and it's going to be called the aortic semilunar valve. Aortic semilunar. Shoot it through the aortic semilunar, we get to number 8. This big, massive blood vessel called the aorta travels through this arch, goes through several different blood vessels to go feed the upper regions of the body, right? Because we're feeding all these tissues oxygen. And it also descends downward to get down to all the rest of the body tissues below, including, as we mentioned earlier, the kidneys, right? So this blood vessel would eventually turn into the renal artery in one branch. So we say 9 is going to be the body tissues. Body tissues. It also includes, we're not drawing it here, the coronary system, the coronary arteries, the arteries that actually feed the heart tissue itself and then drain through the coronary sinus to come back to the right atrium. Now, once we feed all of the tissues of the body, right, so at the body cells, I'll just draw here. Here are the body cells. We are going to deliver that oxygenated blood high in O2, give it to the cells, and the cells of the body are going to exchange their CO2, their high amount of CO2, with that oxygen. So now we have high CO2 in the blood, low oxygen in the blood. They turn deoxygenated at the body tissues, right? So eventually, that blood is going to drain back towards the heart. Number 10. Either from lower regions of the body upward or upper regions of the body downward, and that is going to be through the vena cava. Vena cava literally translates to vein, cave, and it can be either the lower one, being the inferior vena cava, or it can be the superior vena cava. Okay? So it can be either the superior or inferior vena cava, depending on where we are coming back from. And that's what's happening in the cardiovascular system. Now, before you go, be on the lookout. I'm going to give some special tutoring sessions for a really good price very soon. So keep posted on Organized Biology YouTube. Now, I didn't get the time to go through the reproductive system, so definitely check that out next. Also look at your A&P1 review. And if YouTube thinks they know you, here's what they want you to watch next. Thanks for watching it.